In September 1695, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the richest ship in the world was being torn apart. The Ganj-i-Sawai, the exceeding treasure, belonged to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, the most powerful ruler on earth. She carried 600 passengers returning from the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. She carried gold, silver, gemstones, ivory, and silks, worth what some contemporary accounts estimated at between £300,000 and £600,000 sterling, in an age when a Royal Navy captain earned less than £300 a year. She also carried 62 cannons and 400 muskets. She was supposed to be untouchable, and yet a single English privateer turned pirate, commanding a ship with 46 guns and fewer than 150 men, took her in a battle that lasted roughly 2 hours. What followed aboard that Mughal ship over the next several days would trigger the worst diplomatic crisis in the early history of the East India Company, threaten the entire English commercial presence in Asia, and come within a bureaucratic heartbeat of provoking a war between the Mughal Empire and the English crown. The pirate who did all of this was Henry Every, sometimes spelled Avery, sometimes called John Every, recorded in trial transcripts under half a dozen aliases. He was, by the autumn of 1695, the most wanted man on the planet. The Privy Council in London issued the first worldwide manhunt in recorded history. The bounty was £500, more than most Englishmen would earn in a lifetime. The East India Company doubled it. The Mughal Emperor made it clear that if Every was not caught, every English merchant in India would pay the price. And here is the fact that makes Henry Every unlike any other pirate in the Golden Age, the fact that has haunted historians for over 3 centuries. He was never caught. He was never seen again. He walked off the stage of history with the greatest haul in the annals of maritime crime, and he simply ceased to exist. No confirmed death, no confirmed burial, no confirmed sighting after 1696. This is the story of the man they called the King of Pirates, and of the ghost he became. To understand how Henry Every came to commit the crime of his century, you need to understand 2 worlds that were about to collide. The first was the Indian Ocean of the 1690s, specifically the Red Sea trade route between the port of Mocha in Yemen and the western coast of India. Every year, a Mughal convoy sailed this route carrying pilgrims to and from Mecca. These convoys were floating treasure fleets. The Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb was, by most estimates, the wealthiest state on earth in the late 17th century, controlling roughly a quarter of the global economy. The ships that carried its elite back from the Hajj carried the personal wealth of nobles, merchants, and members of the imperial court. They also carried trade goods, fine cotton, indigo, spices, worth fortunes in any European port. The second world was the English maritime underworld of the early 1690s. The War of the Grand Alliance, also called the 9 Years' War, had employed thousands of English seamen as privateers against France. That war would not formally end until the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, but even while it raged, the conditions for piracy were forming. Experienced sailors, skilled in gunnery and navigation, were poorly paid when they were paid at all. Privateering commissions were unreliable. Investors launched ventures, failed to fund them, and left crews stranded in foreign ports with empty pockets and loaded guns. When the war finally ended, the problem would explode. Thousands of decommissioned seamen would turn to what historians call the Pirate Round, a route from the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean, where Mughal treasure ships offered prizes that Caribbean merchantmen could never match. Henry Every did not wait for the peace. He got there first. The political structure that made this possible was simple and cynical. Colonial governors in the Bahamas, in the American colonies, particularly in New York under Benjamin Fletcher, quietly sheltered returning pirates in exchange for bribes. The stolen goods flowed into Anglo-American commerce. London knew. London looked the other way. As long as the victims were Mughal subjects and not English merchants, piracy in the Indian Ocean was someone else's problem. That calculation was about to be tested to destruction. What we know about Henry Every before 1694 is frustratingly thin and often contradictory. Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pyrates, published in 1724, claims he was born in the village of Newton Ferrers near Plymouth, Devon. Trial depositions from 1696 suggest he may have served in the Royal Navy and later worked in the Atlantic slave trade, possibly as a first mate aboard a slaving vessel operating between West Africa and the Caribbean. What the documentary record confirms is this. By early 1694, Henry Every was serving as first mate aboard the Charles II, a 46-gun privateer fitted out by a consortium called the Spanish Expedition Shipping Company. The scheme was ostensibly legitimate. The Charles II and 3 other vessels had been commissioned by the Spanish government to attack French smugglers in the Caribbean. But the venture was mismanaged from the start. The ship sat idle in the harbour of A Coruña in northwest Spain for months. The crew had not been paid. Provisions were running low. The investors in London were losing interest. On the night of May 7, 1694, Henry Every led a mutiny. It was efficient, professional, and almost bloodless, while the captain, a man named Charles Gibson, lay drunk in his cabin. Every and a corps of loyal Confederates seized the ship. The few crew members who objected were put ashore. By dawn, the Charles II was under sail and heading for open water. Every renamed her the Fancy. The ship was formidable, 46 guns, fast for her size, and now crewed by men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Every's first act as captain was to write a remarkable letter, addressed to all English ship commanders, which he arranged to have distributed at the Cape Verde Islands. In it, he declared that he had never yet wronged any English or Dutch, and pledged that he would not do so. The letter was both a public relations manoeuvre and a calculated signal. Every intended to prey on non-European shipping. The Indian Ocean was his destination. Over the following months, Every sailed south along the African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and entered the Indian Ocean. Along the way, he accumulated a small flotilla, other pirate vessels, including the sloops Amity, Pearl, Dolphin, Portsmouth Adventure, and Susanna, whose captains recognized the opportunity he represented. By the time Every reached the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb at the mouth of the Red Sea in mid-1695, he commanded a fleet of roughly 6 vessels and between 450 and 500 men. They positioned themselves at the choke point, and they waited for the Mughal convoy. The Mughal fleet that sailed from Mocha in August 1695 consisted of roughly 25 ships. The 2 largest, and the 2 that carried the real wealth, were the Fateh Muhammad and the Ganj-i-Sawai. The Fateh Muhammad was a substantial vessel belonging to Abdul Ghaffur, one of the richest merchants in Surat. The Ganj-i-Sawai was something else entirely, the personal property of the Emperor Aurangzeb himself, carrying members of his court, their retinues, and their accumulated wealth from the Hajj. She was the largest ship in the Indian Ocean. Estimates of her armament range from 62 to over 80 cannons, with 400 muskets and a crew of several hundred supplemented by Rajput soldiers. Every's fleet missed the main convoy in the night. Most of the Mughal ships slipped past the pirates in the dark, but the 2 richest prizes, perhaps because they were the slowest, lagged behind. The Fateh Muhammad was taken first. The accounts suggest it was a quick surrender, possibly after only a token exchange of fire. The haul was significant. Contemporary estimates put it at £50,000 to £60,000 in gold and silver. But the Fateh Muhammad was the appetizer. The Ganj-i-Sawai was the main course. What happened next has been reconstructed from Mughal court records, East India Company correspondence, and the later trial depositions of Every's crew. The engagement began when one of the Ganj-i-Sawai's cannons exploded on firing, a catastrophic failure that killed several of her own gunners and demoralized the crew at the worst possible moment. The Fancy closed the distance and poured in a broadside. Every's men boarded. The battle lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. When it was over, Every's crew controlled the ship. What followed over the next several days aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai was, by every surviving account, horrific. Mughal records, particularly letters from the court officials and the later testimony compiled by the East India Company's agents, describe systematic robbery accompanied by widespread torture and sexual violence against the passengers, including women of the court. The scale of the atrocities was severe enough that several passengers reportedly threw themselves overboard rather than endure further abuse. These are not legends or embellishments. They are documented in multiple independent sources from both sides of the encounter. The treasure was staggering. The exact figures are contested, but the combined haul from the Fateh Muhammad and the Ganj-i-Sawai has been estimated at between £300,000 and £600,000 sterling. Divided among Every's crew, each man received roughly £1,000, more than a working sailor could earn in 40 years. Every Khan, as captain, received 2 shares. Now picture this. You are Sir John Gaya, the senior East India Company official on the western coast of India. It is October 1695. A battered Mughal ship has limped back to Surat with its survivors. The news of what happened aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai is spreading through the Mughal court like fire through dry grass. And Emperor Aurangzeb is incandescent. This is the part of the Henry Every story that rarely makes it into the popular mythology. And it should, because it is arguably more consequential than the robbery itself. The diplomatic crisis triggered by the attack on the Ganj-i-Sawai threatened to destroy the East India Company's entire commercial presence in India, and with it, the economic foundation of England's imperial future in Asia. Aurangzeb's response was swift and ferocious. He ordered the immediate arrest and imprisonment of every English East India Company factor in Surat. Sir John Gaya and his senior staff were placed under armed guard, effectively hostages. Mughal soldiers surrounded the English factory. Trading privileges were suspended. The emperor threatened to mobilize his army against the English settlement at Bombay itself, a military force that could have erased it from existence. Understand the scale of the asymmetry here. The Mughal Empire commanded an army of hundreds of thousands, governed a population of over 150 million, and controlled an economy that dwarfed England's. The East India Company, at this point in its history, was a trading concern with a handful of fortified warehouses and a few thousand employees scattered across the subcontinent. It existed in India at the emperor's sufferance. If Aurangzeb decided the English presence was more trouble than it was worth, there was nothing, militarily, diplomatically, or commercially, that London could do about it. The company's directors in London understood this perfectly. Their dispatches from this period border on panic. The company was forced to pay substantial reparations to the Mughal court. The exact amount is debated, but it ran into tens of thousands of pounds. They were forced to promise armed naval escorts for future Mughal convoys. They were forced to grovel in writing to an emperor who regarded all European merchants as minor functionaries operating at the edge of his attention. And all of this, the arrests, the threats, the financial hemorrhage, the existential risk to England's commercial future, was caused by one man with one ship. A man who, by the time the diplomatic crisis reached its peak, had already vanished. Every sailed the Fancy across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape, and into the Atlantic. His fleet had scattered. Some captains went their own way, some crews dispersed at various ports. Every himself, with a core group of loyalists and an enormous quantity of portable wealth, made for the Caribbean. In April 1696, the Fancy arrived at the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, the future Nassau. The governor, Nicholas Trott, was the kind of colonial official who understood that principles were negotiable when gold was involved. Every reportedly bribed Trott with the Fancy herself, along with ivory and a quantity of cash, in exchange for safe harbour and permission to disperse. The crew fanned out. Some remained in the Caribbean. Some made for the American colonies, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, where stolen Indian Ocean gold was absorbed into the local economy with minimal questions asked. And then the trail goes cold. The Privy Council's warrant of November 1696 described Evri in general terms and offered the £500 reward. The East India Company added its own bounty. Broadsheets circulated Evri's description, or what passed for one, across England, Ireland, Scotland, and the colonies. 6 of Evri's crewmen were eventually captured and tried at the Old Bailey in London in October 1696. A first trial, remarkably, resulted in acquittal. They were retried, convicted, and 5 were hanged. 1 died in custody before the sentence could be carried out. Their testimony provides much of what we know about the voyage, but Evri himself was never found. He produced no letters, signed no documents, appeared in no court records, and left no identifiable trace after his departure from the Bahamas. The most wanted man in the world had disappeared as completely as if the Indian Ocean had swallowed him whole. This is where the historical record ends and the legend layer begins. And it is important to keep the two cleanly separated. Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, provides the most detailed and the most widely repeated account of Evri's fate. According to Johnson, Evri returned to England under an assumed name, settled in the port town of Bidford in Devon, and attempted to convert his stolen jewels and precious stones into cash through intermediaries, merchants in Bristol, who agreed to fence the goods. Johnson claims these merchants systematically cheated Evri, taking the gems and paying him a fraction of their value, or nothing at all. Eventually, Johnson writes, Evri was reduced to poverty and died without so much as being able to afford himself a coffin. It is a satisfying narrative. The pirate king brought low by the same greed that drove him to sea. But there are serious reasons to treat it with caution. Johnson's general history, whatever its merits as a source, is not a documentary record. Its author, whose real identity remains disputed, with some scholars suggesting Daniel Defoe, was writing for a London reading public that appreciated moral fables. The died in poverty ending is almost too neat, too narratively convenient, to accept at face value without corroboration. And there is no independent corroboration. No parish record from Bidford or any other Devon town has been convincingly linked to an interment of Henry Evri. No legal case involving the defrauding merchants has been found. No contemporary news account, letter, or diary entry from the late 1690s or early 1700s mentions a former pirate living quietly in the West Country. Alternative theories persist. Some historians have suggested Evri fled to Madagascar, which in the 1690s served as a quasi-independent pirate haven. The legend of a pirate colony called Libertalia on the island, almost certainly fictional, sometimes gets tangled up with the Evri story, but there is no credible evidence he settled there. Others have proposed Ireland as a destination, since several of his crew were known to be Irish, but this too lacks documentary support. A more recent and intriguing line of research has examined whether Evri may have returned to the Devon coast under an alias and lived out his life in obscurity, not in the dramatic poverty of Johnson's account, but in the quiet anonymity of a man with enough stolen gold to buy silence. In 2020, a metal detectorist in Rhode Island discovered a 17th century Arabian silver coin, a piece consistent with the Ganj-i-Sawai loot, near the site of a known colonial-era tavern, adding a small thread to the web of Evri-related finds in New England that suggest at least some of the stolen treasure entered circulation in the American colonies. But the coins trace the treasure, not the man. The honest answer is the one that frustrates. We do not know what happened to Henry Evri. The documentary record stops in 1696. Everything after that is inference, tradition, or fiction. What makes Evri's disappearance even more remarkable is the scale of the legend that grew in the void he left behind. Within a decade of his vanishing, Henry Evri was the most famous pirate in the English-speaking world. More famous during his own era than Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts would ever be during theirs. In 1709, a Dutch-English publication called The Life and Adventures of Captain John Avery, sometimes attributed to Adrian van Broek, imagined Evri as a pirate king who had married a Mughal princess, founded a sovereign pirate nation in Madagascar, and lived in royal splendor. The account was entirely fictional, but it was widely believed. In 1713, the playwright Charles Johnson, a different man from the author of the general history, staged the successful Pirate at London's Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. It was the first play in English history to make a pirate the protagonist. The character was transparent, every, thinly disguised, celebrated as a man who had defied empires and escaped with his freedom. Daniel Defoe, if he is indeed the author of the general history, was clearly fascinated by every. His 1720 pamphlet, The King of Pirates, styled as letters written by Every himself, added further layers to the myth while blurring the line between journalism and fiction in ways that Defoe perfected. The cultural legacy runs deeper than individual works. Every was, in many ways, the prototype for the romantic pirate figure that would eventually find its way into Robert Louis Stevenson, J.M. Barrie, and the Hollywood tradition. The idea of the pirate who steals a king's treasure, outwits the world's navies, and vanishes into legend. That is, the Every template. When a character called the Dread Pirate Roberts appears in William Goldman's The Princess Bride, a name that is passed from one man to the next because the legend is more valuable than any individual, the literary DNA traces back, through Bartholomew Roberts, through Johnson, to Henry Every standing on the quarterdeck of the Fancy as it disappeared over the horizon. But strip away the romance for a moment. Strip away the broadside ballads and the Drury Lane plays and the treasure maps. Look at what Henry Every actually left behind. He left a shattered ship full of traumatized Mughal pilgrims, many of them women who had been assaulted by his crew. He left a diplomatic crisis that imprisoned innocent English merchants, cost the East India Company a fortune in reparations, and came within a whisper of destroying England's commercial foothold in Asia, a foothold that would, in the following century, become the foundation of the British Raj. He left 5 of his own men to hang at Execution Dock, while he walked free with their shared plunder. And he left a question that has never been answered. The manhunt for Henry Every was the first truly global exercise in international criminal justice, and it failed completely. The Privy Council warrant, the East India Company bounty, the descriptions circulated across 3 continents, all of it produced nothing. One man, in an age before photographs, before telegraph, before fingerprints, simply chose to stop being Henry Every, and the combined machinery of 2 empires could not find him. There is something in that fact that unsettles, even now. We live in an age of surveillance, of digital footprints, of facial recognition. The idea that a person could commit the crime of the century and then simply cease to exist feels impossible, anachronistic, like a magic trick from an era that still had room for mystery. But Henry Every did it, or at least, the absence of evidence says he did. Picture the Indian Ocean on a September evening in 1695. The sun is going down. The water is the colour of hammered bronze. Somewhere out there, a 46-gun ship called the Fancy is sailing west with more gold than most nations hold in their treasuries, and a crew that knows every navy on earth will soon be hunting them. And at the helm, or in the great cabin, or on the quarterdeck, or wherever a man goes when he is thinking about how to disappear, stands Henry Every. He is looking at the horizon he will sail over, and over, and over, until one day he crosses it for the last time and does not come back. No grave, no parish record, no final scene, just the ocean, the sunset, and the silence that followed. Some men are captured, some men are hanged, some men die in their beds, old and comfortable, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes or their virtues. Henry Every did none of those things. He became something else. Something that the empires and the merchants and the historians and the playwrights could never quite get their hands on. He became a ghost, and ghosts, by their nature, do not leave forwarding addresses. The Indian Ocean does not remember him. The water off the coast of Yemen does not keep records. The harbour at Nassau has been dredged and rebuilt 100 times since a 46-gun ship was handed to a corrupt governor as a bribe. But the question remains, 330 years later, drifting in the fog where history meets legend. Where did Henry Every go? And the only answer the ocean gives is the sound it has always given. The sound of water closing over the place where a ship used to be.